I'm Sarah Purcell, and I'm Professor of History and Director of the Rosenfield Program in Public Affairs, International Relations, and Human Rights. It's our pleasure to co-host this week's symposium in honor of our 2014 prize winners, and I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to introduce today's keynote speaker. The idea that we have in combining the keynote speech for this symposium week with the awards ceremony is to really bring together the inspiration of our prize winners at the beginning of the flourishing of their careers in social justice and social entrepreneurship work with someone who can inspire us with tales from a longer career in that kind of work. And it's just such a thrill. It's such a thrill to have the opportunity to have that come to fruition today. We couldn't think of a better person to join us than Charlayne Hunter-Gault. She is, as I'm sure most of you know, an award-winning journalist with more than 40 years in the industry, working in every medium, and herself a pioneer of civil rights. She's a trailblazer in her own right and the author of 3 books, In My Place, a memoir of the civil rights movement, fashioned around her experiences as the first Black woman to attend the University of Georgia. She was, in fact, one of 2 students to integrate that university. She also wrote New News Out of Africa, Uncovering the African Renaissance, and her latest book is To the Mountaintop, My Journey Through the Civil Rights Movement, a book for high school, college readers, and beyond. She will be signing copies of that book and a few of her others. Immediately after today's ceremony, you can join us across the street at Jessie Macy House for a reception and a book signing and have a chance to speak with her. As a global journalist, Hunter-Gault worked at NPR as special correspondent after spending 6 years as CNN's Johannesburg bureau chief and correspondent. Before that, she worked as NPR's chief correspondent in Africa. Hunter-Gault joined NPR in 1997 after 20 years with PBS, where she worked as a national correspondent for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. She was a very familiar face to many of us who loved PBS in those years. She began her journalism career as a reporter for The New Yorker and later worked as a local news anchor for WRC-TV in Washington, D.C., and as the Harlem bureau chief for The New York Times. She has written for numerous publications, including Essence, O Magazine, The New York Times Magazine, and The Book Review, Vogue, and many others. And her numerous honors, which are really too long to list, include 2 Emmy Awards. They're too long to list. I would try, but they're too long to list. They include 2 Emmy Awards, 2 Emmy Awards, and 2 Peabody Awards. Now you're going to make me list them. 2 Peabody Awards. One for her work on Apartheid's People, a NewsHour series about South African life during apartheid, and the other for general coverage of Africa in 1998. She was also the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Association of Black Journalists, the American Women in Radio and Television Award, and a 2004 National Association of Black Journalists Award for her CNN series on Zimbabwe. Amnesty International awarded Hunter-Gault for her human rights reporting, especially for her PBS series, Rights and Wrongs, a human rights television magazine. And in 2005, she was inducted into the National Association of Black Journalists Hall of Fame. She's a very sought-after public speaker, and she holds more than 36 honorary degrees, of course, the most important of which is her 1984 Doctorate of Humane Letters from Grinnell College. Just one of her recent business ventures is producing, with her husband, Ron Gault, Grinnell class of 1962, producing wine for export to the U.S. from South Africa under the label Passages. So she is truly a Renaissance woman and a real accomplishment for social justice. So we welcome her back to Grinnell College, Charlayne Hunter-Gault.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I guess I could say at this point, it's good to be home. Because as our winners today were received, I was received at Grinnell those years she mentioned, and my husband had laid the groundwork for me by being a student here and talking about Grinnell endlessly. So I really did feel home when I first came, and I especially feel it now. I'm so happy to be here today on such an auspicious occasion. It was heralded as I got off the plane in Des Moines. There is a huge poster, a beautiful, it's more elegant than a poster, but that's the only word I can think of right now. But it's beautiful, and it talks about this amazing award. And of course, you can't miss it when you get off the flight. I'm also happy to be here to personally congratulate the winners today. Because in each of your cases, and we've chatted a little bit beforehand, but in each of your cases, I am intimately familiar with the problems that you are solving. I've been in Kenya all over the place and know how important what you're doing is to the people who live there, and hopefully it will expand to other parts of the continent. And as many drugs as I have to take at this age, I'm glad you're giving some of them to people who really need them. I really do. This is a heartfelt congratulation. It's not just pro forma. Let me also congratulate Dr. Kington, Grinnell College, for its embrace of both the local and the global community. It carries the dream of Martin Luther King, and his dream embraced not only the beloved community here at home in the United States, but also the global community around the world. What many don't know, since there's been so much emphasis on Dr. King's civil rights work here in the United States, and especially in the Deep South, where one of our winners comes from, we share Atlanta, is that there's been so much attention focused on his civil rights work in America that not a lot has been focused, or has been up to now, focused on his global work. The work that he called and focused on what he called the global community, or the World House. As early as 1954, a year before he became involved with Birmingham, Alabama, the movement there, Martin Luther King's eyes were on the prize of freedom and justice at home and abroad. But Dr. King's world focus was, of course, lost in the drama of the United States Civil Rights Movement as it gained momentum and attention. But it was never far from his mind. In fact, in 1954, he told an audience in Boston the following. He said, "As we grow and come to see the oneness of mankind and the geographical oneness of the world made possible by man's scientific and technological ingenuity, more and more we are going to have to try to see our oneness in terms of brotherhood. This does not mean," he says, "that everyone has to agree at every point." Some of our leaders could take note of that right now. There could be a world government, he said, where diversity can exist, and this would lessen many of the tensions we face today. Now, this is 1954, he's saying this. He goes on to say, "And it would also enable everybody to understand that we are clothed in a single garment of destiny, and whatever affects one nation directly in the world indirectly affects us all." Now, I think it's time for that quote to be running across every television station in America, particularly now when we are so confused about what we need to be doing with ourselves. And so it is that Grinnell College carries on that tradition of focusing locally as well as globally. And that's why I think it's important for us never to lose sight of the values that Dr. King and all of us back in those days embraced. For they are values that even predated Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement. For they are values that are timeless and transcendent. And they are useful as we face, in Dr. King's words, some difficult days ahead. So in the next few minutes, I would like to share, and I got my watch here, so we can get to some of that. No, we don't have any passages here, but there will be of reception. So I don't want to take too long, but I want to take a little time to go back to that moment, which was the 60s, a time like no other in my own lifetime, as well as a defining moment in American history. That time is always on my mind because I wouldn't be here today with the one or two little things that were mentioned earlier unless so many people had dedicated their lives to my ability to get an education, to the proposition that all of us are created equal. But I've been closer to those years in the past 2 years by joining people who were on the front lines of the struggle and who did change not just the face of the American South, but the face of America in the eyes of the world. Because remember, in those days, it was the contest between the Soviets and their system of governance and ours. And so what happened in the South affected what the people's perceptions of America around the world. Last year, for example, I was at the anniversary, the 50th, of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And I met people there who had been a part of that struggle and had come to celebrate it and commemorate it at that time. And I'll come back to them in a few minutes on another point. But this year, I've been involved in a variety of commemorations of the 1964 Civil Rights Act with many people whose friendship dates back to those heady and sometimes painful times. Most recently, this past summer, there's a program sponsored by Howard University and the Justice Department, and many of those who participated in those programs remembered and recalled what it took to get the Justice Department, as well as two presidents, JFK and LBJ, on board to protect those who were marching and demonstrating, going on freedom rides, getting beaten, arrested, and yes, sometimes murdered for justice and equality. We forget that. And we should remember the good things that they did, but if we want to understand history and how we have evolved and how our leaders have evolved, and hope that some will today, we need to understand that there has been a process in which this has actually happened, and it happened with our two remarkable presidents, LBJ and JFK. So it was inspiring to hear the people who were involved in those struggles talk about the victories won, but also the challenges that lie ahead, all understanding that the preamble to our Constitution speaks in terms not of a perfect union, but a more perfect union. And what that means is that the founders, I think, were prescient in their understanding of human imperfections and the need to be ever vigilant in a process that involves human beings. So we need to remember the history to give us the inspiration to continue the journey towards what? A more perfect union, no matter the challenges, because today there are many. In fact, I was just at Jimmy Carter's 90th birthday last week, and when he was asked about, well, he'd been asked this at Emory a few days earlier by one of the students, how would he describe the situation in America today? And the word he used was interesting. He said it took him a few minutes to come up, because it was a difficult question initially. But then as he processed that, he came up with the word searching. Now think about that for a minute, but not too long. Just listen to me for the next few minutes. Now, many of the people at these commemorations were people I knew personally, for I entered the 60s as a child of Brown, that Supreme Court decision that outlawed the lie of separate but equal. My efforts to realize my dream of becoming a journalist have already been referred to. I was the first Black woman to attend the University of Georgia, along with my late colleague, Hamilton Holmes. But it took 5 years, after the 1954 decision for anybody in the South to make a move. In fact, when I was doing the first book, In My Place, I couldn't remember ever hearing about the Brown decision in 1954. Of course, I was in the 7th grade. So I got in touch with one of my 7th grade teachers. And you know what she told me? She said that the white power structure, which was the separate and unequal part of our lives, they ran everything. They had actually forbidden the teachers, the black teachers, to talk about the 54 decision on pain of firing for the rest of their lives, not for the next semester or term, but for the rest of their lives. So when the decision came down in May 17th, 1954, none of us in our schools heard about it from our teachers. Now, as my case wound its way up the federal courts through one roadblock after another from 1959 to 1961, a restlessness was already taking place in college dormitories, especially one in North Carolina, where the students, 4 black young men, started a bull session. But before the night was over, they had come up with a scheme to go downtown, buy some things in the Woolworth store or one of the department stores, and then try and eat at the place where they were also spending their money. And of course, I can see some of you nodding. The rest is history. By the next day, they went down there, they bought a few little things and went to the counter to eat. They were viciously attacked. The first day they went was just the 4 of them, but day after day, more and more students came. They were viciously attacked. The young women had lighted cigarettes put down their backs, hot coffee poured on the brothers, but they made it. And what I think is interesting is that Diane Nash, who actually later was a student at the time, but she said, you know, there were times when we would practice some things such as how to protect your head from a beating and how to protect each other. If one person was taking a severe beating, we would practice other people putting their bodies in between that person and the violence so that the violence could be more distributed and hopefully no one would get seriously injured. We would practice not striking back if someone struck us, because this was the teaching of Martin Luther King, which he had gotten from Mahatma Gandhi, non-violence. Now, John Lewis, and we all know John Lewis, I'm surprised he has a modicum of sense today, the number of times he's been hit in the head demonstrating for justice. But somehow I don't know, I'll talk to the doctor about this. How you maintain a brain that is constantly receiving blows. At any rate, he said in those days, to go to jail was to bring shame and disgrace to the family. It went against everything these young black students had been taught at home. But they hoped the arrest would get national publicity that would embarrass the federal government into either helping or protecting them. And Diane Nash recalled this. She said, and I think this is probably true about what you guys are doing, and ladies, guys is not my preference to say, my guys and women. She said, the movement had a way of reaching inside you and bringing out things that you didn't even know were there, such as courage. She said, when it was time to go to jail, I was much too busy to be afraid. And as she saw it, they started feeling the power of an idea whose time had come. So this is how the civil rights movement began, with just a handful of students. And the idea quickly spread to other places in the South. Julian Bond recalled this summer at one of those sessions we were attending. And so he and a bunch of students from Atlanta went up to join these students. And one of the people they came across, so I want you to know, it's important for the young people to do innovative things, but every now and then you have to listen to your elders. So these young people anxious to get on with fighting for freedom, hear a woman by the name of Ella Baker. Now, Ella Baker was a little bit older, but Ella Baker was also prescient, and she told these young people who had started the movement, actually, as I said before, at a lunch counter, ordering a hamburger. And Julian credits Ella Baker with telling the students that the movement that they were about to be a part of was about more than a hamburger. It was about freedom and justice. And she also encouraged the students to go their own way. Because up to that point, and that's why I say, you know, even before Martin Luther King and others, there were people fighting for freedom. There always were. But they had done, especially the NAACP and the established organizations, had done it in a very deliberate way, which these young people thought eventually was too slow. They were doing it through the courts. So they formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which came to be known as SNCC. And they were called the shock troops of the movement because they would go where the elders feared to tread. However, and this is what we learned, everybody's involved. Because when the shock troops would get arrested, who came to bail them out? And who had the money but the NAACP Legal Defense Fund? So, you know, in their own ways, they all worked together. They had their moments. But at any rate, you know, they actually worked together. Now, I'm not going to go as deep as I would have gone in my book to talk about the critical years of the civil rights movement and the cost, as I said, including death. In fact, I asked Skip Gates once when I was writing this book, I said, you know, I think you all know who Skip is, right? He's the one who got arrested for trying to get in his own house. Anyway, I said, Skip, on every page, I'm writing about violence, and I'm worried because I want young people to read this book, and I don't want them to be upset. And he said, you've been living in Africa too long. Have you noticed what these young people are watching on television and the games that they're playing and, you know, with their iPads and things? So he said, go ahead and write about that violence because it was a violence with a purpose. And so that brings me to recall what I think was one of the great aspects of the civil rights movement, and it was the broad coalition of people of every race and creed and color. As I said earlier, I was going to go back to being at the 1963 March commemoration last year. I was there working for NBC, and as I was about to go into the area at the Lincoln Memorial where we had our platform, I saw these two older gentlemen in a golf cart. And I had a torn meniscus at the time, and I didn't want to walk a great distance, so I got in the golf cart with them. Now, their hair was as gray as mine, though slightly less of it, and they were slightly more ambulatorially challenged than I was, but they could not have been prouder to show me the large round lapel buttons they had inscribed with March on Washington, 1963. They had saved these buttons. Can you imagine? I can't imagine finding anything I had 2 years ago, let alone all those years ago. But there they had them, and both of them, as we discussed, were Jewish. Now, to be sure, the civil rights movement focused on the laws that prevented black people from becoming whole citizens. But the victory was achieved by people young and old from both the North and the South, and eventually from all over the United States who were every race, creed, and color, and who marched and sat in and were beaten and, yes, murdered. I was so excited to meet these old men and to recall their own history because a lot of the people who did get involved in the civil rights movement who had families at least, or who had some connection to the Holocaust. Now, again, back briefly to 1961, I want to mention it because it was one of the busiest and bloodiest of the civil rights years. It was a year that tested the nonviolent commitment of young activists, and it was also the year that a young man was born by the name of Barack Hussein Obama. Now, why I bring that up is not to say that this is the guy I voted for. My husband doesn't even know who I voted for. But yet, I bring it up because we have a president of the United States whose mother was white, who taught him that she taught him the history of black people in America. I mean, she taught him about the civil rights movement. And so during the 2009 campaign, when he was in Selma, Alabama, he said, "I'm here because somebody marched for freedom. I'm here because y'all sacrificed for me." And then he said, "I stand on the shoulders of giants." Now, his mama taught him that. That's how he knew that. He didn't learn it in school. He learned it at home. And when he was sworn in as America's first black president, he gave John Lewis a copy of one of his books with the words, "But for you, John." And I think that tells us that that's one indication of the importance of our history. At the Justice Department's 2 panels that I talked about earlier at Howard University, Jo Mulholland was one of the first freedom riders, and she was a white Southerner. And she talked about her own involvement in the movement. And I asked her, because I was moderating the panel, how did she, a white woman and a white Southerner at that, put herself in harm's way to help black people? And her answer was simple. She said, "I guess my awakening started when I was in high school," but she went on to say that the church she went to, which was a Little Falls United Presbyterian, she said, taught that we were all equal in the eyes of God. I just felt that if we were going to teach this and say it, we should mean it. So in early '61, she got involved in the Freedom Rides. She went to prison. And even going to prison in those days, if you were white, you got put in one part of the jail. If you were black, you got put in another part. And when the Freedom Rides actually started, John Lewis and the people who were coming with him from Washington, D.C., actually signed their wills. These are young people. Signed their wills because they had no idea if they would be coming back. The South was so dangerous in those days, and sure enough, 3 of their colleagues, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Swerner, were murdered during their drive to register voters. So as I said earlier, whites were in the movement, separated, and often were the victims of a terrible kind of racism, vicious, violent. It's funny because when I was at the University of Georgia in those first few days, they used to call me the N-word, but then they got tired of that. And whenever there would be a Freedom Ride, I'd walk across the campus and they'd yell out, "Freedom Rider!" And I think they thought that this was something derisive. And I would just hold my head up and say to myself, "Right on," you know. At any rate, it was the Freedom Riders, actually, that brought John F. Kennedy and his administration on board. And I have to say that I don't think in those days it was so much because they were on board with what the kids were on board with, but again, it was that image of the United States as it fought against the Soviet Union for world dominance. And so here were all these pictures of Freedom Riders on buses that were bombed by racists down in the South. And one of them in particular, I think it was Anniston, Alabama. It's in my book. You can find it if you're interested. I can't remember at the moment. But it was somewhere in there that they threw a bomb on the bus. And you see these kids coming off the buses, coughing and sneezing, and their eyes watering. Those pictures were decisive in bringing the Kennedy administration on board. And you know, there were a lot of incidents like that. There was another one where even the man whom Kennedy sent down to sort of monitor things and report back was also knocked down. as were other black people who were marching, black and white. And so there were a lot of local blacks who wanted to retaliate. And Dr. King said, no, that's not how we do this. Now, he was aware of the impact of these pictures that had gone across the world. And he said, we have won the victory now. This is a testing point, meaning a testing point for all of them. He said, and for you to know that the time is always right to do right. Now, inspired by wisdom like that and moral compass, students continued to press their cause, but the Freedom Riders had left a powerful legacy and had forced the government to recognize that this was the time to do right. The next phase of activism was partially influenced by the administration, although once again it wasn't so, the reason they did it was to get these ugly pictures off, and so they got the young people to move into voter registration, which was a calmer, or theoretically a calmer, quieter way to achieve the rights. And what happened was that those events, while the Kennedy administration had surreptitiously moved money into the Southern Regional Council to pay for this to happen, this too became a flashpoint for the racists in the South. And it was during that period when Goodman and Cheney and Schwerner were in fact murdered. But that was also when younger people, high school students, which earlier the movement had not wanted to involve because they were so young, but they insisted. And when I go around to schools today and ask young people about who you remember, Martin Luther King, everybody knows. Rosa Parks, everybody knows. Well, what about Brenda Travis? Well, Brenda Travis was one of those high school students who got arrested, and because of the fear in the black community and among the older people, especially those whose jobs were dependent upon the white power structure, when she was released along with the others and tried to go back to school, her principal would not have her. And so ultimately she gets sent to a reform school where I think she was there for a very long time. Now, SNCC ended its voter registration in 1961, but only after it had stirred the hearts and heads of people, including the older people who were fearful of retaliation, but they had encouraged them to take control of their own destiny. Now, a lot of things happened in the interim, including the death of the murder of Medgar Evers, who was walking up his driveway while his wife and children were watching President Kennedy deliver the strongest statement that he had ever given on civil rights, reminding the nation on television of its founding principle and insisting that the rights of every man is diminished when the rights of one are threatened. And as they were listening, their husband, their father, was murdered. So the fact that even when you had the federal government more or less on your side, nothing changed. One of the big commemorations, well, nothing changed in so many ways, but in the minds of so many people who had been oppressed, things were in fact changing, that they could take. So one of the commemorations that took place this year was something that came to be called the COFO Summer, or Freedom Summer, when the white students from the North flooded into Mississippi and other places to register people to vote. And I'm told that it was a wonderful celebration, even as they had to remember the deaths of those 3 men. But at any rate, the young black Mississippians had found their footing, had emboldened their parents, and more black people than ever reached a new determination to register to vote. And in April 1964, a new political party was formed to represent the black masses. It was called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And when they attempted to be seated at the Democratic Convention that year, Lyndon B. Johnson was among those who denied them a seat at the table. But they sang freedom songs, and then they left, and John Lewis remembers this as a critical moment in the history of the civil rights movement, what he called a turning point. And soon, Lyndon Johnson, by this time President Kennedy was gone, but he had supported this whole idea of a Civil Rights Act. So the Civil Rights Act was making its way through the Congress, and activists went there to make sure that the congressman there understood what was really happening. And it was interesting this past summer when Andrew Young talked about how this was a really courageous Congress. And you could see everybody in the audience this past summer going, oh my God, not because of that being a really courageous Congress, but because of the Congress that we currently have. At any rate, when Johnson signed it, Andy Young also recalled that this was the strongest civil rights speech ever given by an American president. Now, what we learned not long after that was that the denial of justice and freedom was not just down south, it was also up south, as the North was called by some of those in the South. And I was, by this time, had graduated and was working at the New Yorker magazine, and was going home once when, after a riot in Brooklyn, for the same kinds of things that the people in the South had been protesting for, only this was a little bit different. And yet, you know, it sort of helped my own consciousness as a journalist to be able to give voice to the voiceless, to understand that discrimination knows no particular race or creed or color or location. Now, I'll quickly note, as Peniel Joseph did in a recent New York Times, that the civil rights unity fractured after Stokely Carmichael came out of jail and talked about Black power. But, you know, today we have a lot of opportunities, I think, to remember the sacrifices that were made during those years, the challenges, but what the ultimate result what the ultimate result was that they were after. Now, that was a terrible sentence, one I just made up. Don't quote me, but you got my point. In other words, today, 50 years after the Voting Rights Act, there's what many see as an effort to take us back to those days that necessitated the COFO summer, and the effort and the resources behind it are formidable. Recently, the New York Times reported, however, that 49 years after the Voting Rights Act and 50 years after the Civil Rights Act, Black voters in the South have played an important role in a handful of federal elections, with their vote in some campaigns representing a reversal of a century-long trend of Black migration from the South. Today, 57% of Black Americans live in Atlanta and other places in the South, and more than 1 million Black Southerners today were born in the Northeast. A Republican in a Southern state recently won in the primary, because you can vote anywhere. You don't have to be in this particular state a member of one party or another to vote in that primary, and Black people elected a Republican who was a moderate person. So you have a lot of progress happening. At the same time, you have the Supreme Court deciding to strike down a central provision of the Voting Rights Act, and that's unleashed a wave of new laws with a disparate impact on Black voters. These laws, according to the Times reporter and others, will disenfranchise an unknown number of eligible voters. In June 11th, 1963, and I'm about to close here, President Kennedy gave a major speech on race. And he lamented the fact that what he said in those days, that was a proper term, the Negro baby born in America today, 1963, regardless of the section of the nation in which he is born, has about 1/2 as much chance of completing a high school as a white baby born in the same place on the same day. 1/3 as much a chance of completing college, 1/3 as much a chance of becoming a professional, twice as much a chance of becoming unemployed, and he goes on. And he went on to say, though, but legislation cannot solve this problem alone. It must be solved in the homes of every American in every community across our country. And many of the statistics that he gave in those days are comparable to statistics that we have today. He could make the same speech with the statistics being more or less the same, if not worse. So what John F. Kennedy said that day about whose job it is to solve these problems is also true today. And what he said is this: it seems to me that these are matters which concern not merely presidents or congressmen or governors, but every citizen of the United States. As I said earlier, the American Civil Rights Movement has been one of the defining moments in our history, but far too many of our young people don't know that history. And what I'm hoping is that partly through my book, but partly through the examples of young people like those we have here today, and I do hope that Grinnell College will publicize their achievements widely, so that it can be known the impact of young people. Frantz Fanon said once that each generation must find its own cause and embrace it or deny it. And I think that's where so many of us here in college environment are, in hoping that we can encourage our young people to do as these have. So, as we look around the country today and listen to some of the virulent rhetoric, you just wonder, what our young people are going to embrace, and if they're going to be taught about the notion of a more perfect union and what it will be, what is needed for them to be involved, particularly as we look at the issue again of not only voting but immigration. Do they know there's a Statue of Liberty in New York that says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," those who are opposing so much of our immigration? Are these words still relevant to the increasingly black and brown, homeless, tempest-tossed, huddled masses yearning to breathe free? And what will it take to make those words a reality for them and to help all Americans realize the possibilities of the American dream? Whatever it takes. Some of the things that I've talked about today are the lessons from the civil rights movement that are timeless and transcendent, not to sit in at lunch counters or to go on freedom rides, but to determine their own path, these young people, emboldened by the victories of young people like themselves at a different time. Or, as John Lewis recently told the college graduating class this year, he said, "What you young people need to do is get in the way." So just as you honor those today, you all have gotten in the way, and you are encouraged, I hope, by this event to keep on doing what you're doing, just as I hope this institution is going to keep on, as we used to say in the South, to keep on keeping on. I am so proud to be associated in so many ways with Grinnell College, and I hope this will not be my last time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Ms. Hunter-Gault is happy to answer a few questions. We will need you to come down to the microphone at the front. So if you are able, please come down to the microphone if you have a question, and she will answer your question. You have to be extra bold.
I was really unhappy the other day at the Brooklyn Book Festival when we finished a panel on Nelson Mandela. And I thought we'd been fairly provocative, especially because Nelson Mandela had talked about how important it was to make friends sometimes with your enemies. And some of us had said, you know, this might be a propitious moment to think about that, given some of the challenges we have. And nobody asked any questions. So, I mean, I'm not.
Please step ahead.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
It's really a pleasure to get to hear you. Lifelong admirer, and my name is Wendy Abraham. The priest at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and I understand that you live part of the year in South Africa, and I would be really interested to hear your descriptions of the country today in the wake of some of the hoped for healing of apartheid, and your impressions of.
Thank you. We've now moved from South Africa, although, as was said earlier, we do continue to bring wine here from South Africa. We hope to get some in Iowa one day. But the question is a serious one, and I want to answer in a very careful way. I often say that what we have to remember about countries like South Africa and others on the continent that have gone and have become democratic in the last few years, South Africa 20 years ago this year, is that they are taking baby steps to democracy. And sometimes we have to look back at our own evolution as a nation and the baby steps that we took in the early years as a democracy. However, I also want to say that I have a vine that grows in our yard in Martha's Vineyard. And some of you can tell me what it is. It's got a little red, little orange in. It's not whatever it is. But you pull it out over here because it's interrupting some of the beautiful flowers, and the next thing you know, it's over here. And I use that metaphor because I'm talking about how South Africa right now is struggling with its own identity as a democracy. And one of its major problems is corruption. And while I think it's important to give the country time to move into its adolescent steps and then into its mature steps as a democracy, I think it's also important to root out this corruption that seems to be taking hold from the top down. That's number one. Number two, what worries me about South Africa worries me equally about this country and our young people. Because while we have 1,600 young people here or thereabouts at Grinnell, in far too many of our poor black communities, our young people are not being properly educated, if educated at all. In South Africa, you have the majority of the population now, young black people, who are not being educated properly, if at all, and certainly not for the kinds of jobs that, the kind of democracy that South Africa is. They're not being educated to further that country's ambitions as an economic power on the continent, the first or the second. If I had a Nigerian here, they'd probably argue they were, but you know, between South Africa and Nigeria, you got me, right? Don't get me, because I'm including you. But it is one of two powerful economies. But who's going to run this country, this one, when the minority becomes the majority in 20 to 60 years, if our young people are not educated? Who's going to run South Africa and succeed Jacob Zuma and whoever succeeds him in the next 20, 30 years if their young people are not also prepared for leadership? So these are the kinds of concerns, and I know Grinnell has a young professor who's going to be going to South Africa and taking some students there. And I think it will be very important to figure out how institutions like this can look at those kinds of problems both here and there. Because we're all in a single garment of destiny. And that's, by the way, the name of this book that talks about Martin Luther King and his preoccupation initially well, not his preoccupation, but his concern with both the global and the local. If we are in a single garment of destiny, I mean, our Ebola crisis tells us also about the necessity for us to have cooperative action, whether it's on diseases like this or whether it's on the education of our young people. So I think that Grinnell has something to offer to South Africa and its young people, especially those who are being poorly and not properly educated, as well as the teachers who, after all, were educated under what they call the Bantu system, which taught that black people were second class and did not have the same rights as everybody else. So they've been poorly educated, and so they're not educating a generation for leadership. I think there's a role for all of us as we look at both our beloved community and our global community. So I'm very cautiously optimistic that South Africa is going to make it, but it's going to need the same kinds of input from people all over the world that we had during the days of apartheid, when everybody was fighting that system called apartheid. It's not over yet. The challenges are a lot, big, huge, big, extreme, whatever. Oh, here comes the Nigerian. She's going to get me now.
I'm Charlayne Lewis. I'm a professor in the history department. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about the current state in the United States. And I was thinking about the current status in the United States and the way in which we're seeing a lot of discussion about structural racism today in our education system, in healthcare system, sanitation and utilities, thinking about Detroit and the water crisis, and of course with the police force. And I'm wondering what encouragement or advice you would give to young people today for how to face these things, how to mobilize. What role do you see young people playing specifically with these issues?
Thank you for the question. I'm going to revert back to Frantz Fanon because I think it was such a fabulous quote that each generation has to decide for itself what it's going to embrace. But as I tried to indicate, I think it's important at institutions like this and others, none like it, of course, but others educating young people to give them a sense of the history and the role that they can play and for them to understand the consequences of not being involved. Because you can't say to them, you got to go out and demonstrate and you got to go out and do this, you have to do, I don't think that's going to work. But what you can talk about is what kind of society do you want to live in? And what kind of contribution do you want to make towards this being a more perfect union? You can't tell somebody to go out and get involved in the kinds of things that they're doing because that might not be them. I mean, this one, Kia, like the car, she said you can remember from the car. She wasn't involved in doing what she's doing today a little while ago, but suddenly she saw a need. She found that herself. And so our young people have to find whatever it is that helps them, I think, but they have to also be taught that it's partly your responsibility if you want to have something to say about the world and the community that you live in. I read this article the other day from Conyers, Georgia. And it was in the New York Times, and it was about how Conyers now has a majority black people, but the reporter went and talked to some of the younger blacks, not college-age students, but those who are out working, but still, in their 30s, whether or not they were going to vote in the midterm elections. And they were saying, this doesn't, I got work to do. I got family to feed. I can't be bothered with this. Well, I understand the sacrifices, especially that single mothers are making with their young children and trying to, do all this, or even whole families today who are struggling to make it. But the answer infuriated me, actually, And I was saying to myself, I wonder if the reporter stepped outside of his quote-unquote objective role and said, do you realize what you just said? You're going to keep this kind of job, working at this kind of job, struggling to make it, if you don't elect some people who understand what you're going through. So I'm hoping that people who are involved in these political, groundwork, will be out there explaining to people how important. I worried about kids and young people in 2008. When I came back, we were still living in South Africa, and it was, what that election was about. And it seemed as if the young people had gone to sleep after they had elected the first black president. History made, gone, back, okay, done. So I was making my rounds on college campuses, and what was amazing to me was that they might have been asleep, but they had awakened, and they were out there in the streets working in political campaigns to get people registered to vote. And so I think that's a really important thing now. Talk to young people about the importance of the vote. And then, they can choose whether to involve themselves in Kenya, where they will be helping the people to have fertilizer that helps them to raise their crops, or whether they are getting medications or whatever. They will have to decide. But there will always be some challenge out there, and they just have to know the history, that young people in this country changed the face of America, and they are just that strong today. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, we get the last questions.
Actually, I think my question builds on a lot of the themes that you raised around youth and engaging young people. And I'm curious if you have an opinion / what is your opinion on the use of social media as a tool of activism relative to, I think, the much more active and local engagement that you experienced when you were growing up in the 60s?
Thank you for not asking me about Nigeria. Because I'm really concerned about those missing schoolgirls, and I think we're forgetting about them, so I'll just throw that in real quick. I tweet. You might be surprised to hear that, but I do. And I read a lot of tweets. And I'm not sure that this is relevant, but I'm also reading about this problem that Facebook is having about people using their real names. And there are people who have a legitimate reason to say, the transgender people are arguing, that they want to use their transgender names and they don't want to use their, but the thing that's bothered me about Facebook and comments that people can leave at the end of articles and stuff, they can leave them with names that are not theirs. And I just wonder, where's the courage of their convictions? I don't pay any attention to a criticism about something that I've written that comes from somebody with a name like, I know who know, or whatever, I don't know. If you want to criticize something that I've written or said, have the courage, I've used my name, have the courage to use your name. That's the one problem I have with Twitter and Facebook and some of these other ones. Well, not so much, yeah, Facebook to a certain extent. But I do think that there is a lot of potential there to organize people. I mean, look what's happening in Hong Kong, and look what's happened in Ferguson and other places where people have, I just think that we all have an obligation, and here I'm putting my journalist hat on now, to insist that our media give us news. When I worked at the NewsHour, we had a phrase, we produce news that can be used. And we need to insist that our media give us news that we can use, as opposed to opinion that buttresses some of our views, whether they're liberal or conservative or whatever. I think that the only way we can, tweeting is great, but it's how many words? So let that lead you to something more substantive. And if we can get that across, to people who are tweeting and who are following tweets, I think that will be a great advance and a positive aspect of tweeting and social media. I did many years ago a program called Rights and Wrongs, and it was a human rights program, and this was before tweeting and all of that. But what we used to do was, we couldn't get into all of these countries that were oppressing their people, but we would somehow see to it that we got cameras in there so that the local people could take pictures and show the world what was going on. It was very successful. Now, we didn't have any way of really checking it, what they were sending us, but we did the best we could, and I think we did a very good job. We were way ahead of our time in that. So I have a very strong attitude, actually, about citizens informing themselves and doing it in a way that isn't, just a soundbite. And what troubles me is that people are upset sometimes with what they're seeing in the news on television, but they just complain to one another. They don't complain to the people who own the networks. They don't write letters. And even, we've seen recently how protest still has an impact. And so protest to a television station. I watched something on television the other day. I could not believe what I was hearing. And I rarely watch that station. I'm not going to even say what it is. You can probably figure out. I could not believe the misinformation. And there was a panel there. And nobody on the panel was taking an opposition to something that was absolutely patently false. So that's where, again, we have to get our young people invested in informing themselves. And one final thing, I just learned not long ago about, microaggression that's happening on campuses? That's got to stop. But it's only going to stop if you have enough young people willing, of all races, creeds, and colors, coming together to say this is not what we do in, what year is this, 2014? It's coming back, it's coming around again. But you can stop that. You can stop that yourself. And you have the power to do that. So just tell yourself. And it's final, I'm gonna close because I know she's getting nervous standing here. It's time to go. I think everybody believes in something fundamentally and we had actually President of Morehouse College spoke on Martha's Vineyard this past summer. And he said they went to South Africa when Nelson Mandela was in pretty good shape, and they had a meeting with him. And they asked him, after a little time and discussion and so forth, they got up the courage to ask him, how did he survive 27 years in prison? And he said, without missing a beat, Mandela said, I believed. So I know you have a, 9-month-old? And some of you are not much older than that. Or you remember back at, But I'm sure that no matter what kind of circumstances you come out of or came out of, you were taught at an early age some principles and some values. And those are values that are, like I tried to talk today about, values that were timeless and transcendent. And I think that if we can remind ourselves every now and then about what we really believe, and that is in the basic humanity of all of our people, and that we live in we are clothed in a single garment of destiny, we can make the world a better place, just as you all are trying to do with the work that you're doing. Thank you.